Hello and welcome to Knockout Game Design. Today I am starting a new series playing through the first game of the Valkyria Chronicles franchise. The focus of the series is the same as always: study the principles of game design by actively pointing out, explaining, and making sense of what I see in what I consider to be masterpiece video games. But first, to introduce the Valkyria Chronicles. The game takes place in a fantastical alternative world Europe during World War II. Guns and armored tanks are the main tools of war, but there is also some magic in the world. Now, I'll talk about the magic and the plot more in later episodes when it becomes relevant. But this is the first impression, both the first video in the series and the first few minutes of gameplay. The developers have a hard job in front of them, quickly bringing a new player up to speed on how to play the game. Today, I want to ask the question, how do they do it? How do the developers teach the game? Anyone who has made a game can empathize here. This is incredibly challenging. Mobile games typically have a single-digit retention rate after the first 30 days. Even paid games have a retention problem. Looking at Steam achievements, some games have only 80% of the player base completing the first level. So studying how to hook a player and quickly train them to play is an important skill any developer will need. So what do the developers do in the first few minutes? Well, here's the first thing that I noticed. Earlier, I said that this game takes place in magical Europe during World War II, and that's not entirely correct. Taking a step back, this is a game about a textbook about magical Europe in World War II. It's very Shakespearean, a story within a story. This is a very unique way to structure a game, so why do this? A game about a book seems weird, but I think the developers made the right call here, and I think there are a few key reasons for doing this. The book structure offers a natural level selection menu. It's elegant, pleasing to look at, and organizes the levels and cutscenes in a natural, linear way. People are familiar with books, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel here. Reusing structures and patterns like this is good design. You don't need to have a tutorial for a player. They will just naturally know what's next and how to select the next level. Also, the book looks cool. Any way that you can make the game's menu more than just a user interface overlay is an improvement. Finding ways in your game to make the UI part of the game world is a good idea and helps to pull a player into your virtual world. Additionally, presenting it in this way helps to break up some of the longer cutscenes, and it seems natural. A story-based game is a game about a book. And there are a lot of cutscenes in this game. The opening cutscene alone is actually broken into 3 episodes. It's 9 minutes and 10 seconds total. That's a lot. For context, the first Halo game, which I just finished a series on, I recommend you go check it out, started with a 4-minute and 40-second cutscene. 9 minutes is almost twice as long. That's big, especially by modern standards. Now, yes, this is a 13-year-old game. It came out in 2008. But even then, having 9 minutes of gameplay where the player doesn't actually play is a statement. It sets the tone for the rest of the game. This is a story-driven game. Splitting the opening cutscene up like this actually helps to keep player attention. It's like a progress bar. The player can see themselves making incremental progress. The lesson here, if you have a lot to say in your game, don't be afraid to say it, just break it up a little bit. If a single event takes longer than, 3 minutes or so, it's time to chunk it up. The final point I want to make about this story-in-a-story game structure, there are some storytelling reasons behind it. The developers are attempting to tell a narrative that almost everybody is familiar with. World War II is one of the most influential events in human history. We all know what happens. There will be no twist surprise endings, so the developers embrace and lean into this. One of the opening cutscenes effectively spoils the ending.
Proved that a tiny nation could best a military giant.
And that's okay. We all knew it was coming. It's not about the destination, it's about the journey. So setting the entire game to be a textbook written after the war allows for a narrator to naturally insert remarks like this. Additionally, this game does touch on some pretty heavy and emotionally charged topics. Adding another layer of abstraction between the events depicted on the screen and reality is valuable here. Now, some games try to pull a player deep into their world, but this game provides a solid barrier that works to prevent that. This is a design choice that most games would disagree with, but it's so effective at its job that I just had to point it out. Here, the player has several layers of abstraction separating them from the game, which prevents them from becoming deeply immersed in the world. So when a character dies or the horrors of World War II are explored, the player's enjoyment isn't entirely ruined. After a series of opening cutscenes, which need no tutorial as the player is passively watching, the very first tutorial the player encounters is here: how to save the game. The developers have given the saving affordance the honor of being the first thing the player is to learn. Open the menu by pushing the F key and select Save. Then a text box provides some advice. Saving is a good idea, but especially before, during, and after a combat op. The developers are doing something subtle here that I think is important. They're not explaining everything to a player. What's a combat op? What kind of things can happen there? Additionally, they just said open the menu and select save, but there are all these other options in the menu that haven't been formally introduced. Effectively, the player has been given an optional quest and a little advice, but it's up to them to explore on their own and to make their own choices. This is more fun than reading text on a screen, but comes with a risk. With unclear instructions, the player may get lost and confused. It's a fine line to balance. Too much tutorial and the player may get bored. Too little hand-holding and a player may get lost and frustrated. Here, the developers are trying to maximize player exposure to the game with a minimum amount of tutorial text. The player doesn't need to know what the chapter and tab select items are in the menu, but player familiarity is important when these items are eventually unlocked and explained. This is good design. It helps the player to quickly learn without being overwhelmed. Earlier, I said the book structure was good design because everybody should be familiar with it. That's the whole point of design, building a system that needs no tutorial and which naturally makes sense. I'm almost 7 minutes into a video about game design and there has been no gameplay yet. Let's try to fix that. Our first combat operation begins in what the game calls command mode. This is a bird's eye view of the operation map, with good guys as blue icons and bad guys as red icons. Now, there's not much a player can do while in command mode. Moving the cursor pans the map so a player can see more or less the entire battlefield. Selecting one of the units activates it, and the player drops down into action mode, a third-person camera view where the player has direct control over one of the characters. This is good design. With a smooth camera transition like this, it is clear what happened. The player is now in control of the unit they selected. The devs don't even need to explain it. Instead, the devs focus their time explaining other things, action points, and the finer details of moving and shooting. Again, the developers are using design elements to help them reduce the amount of text tutorials the player has to read through. The specific design element here is a dynamic camera transition instead of jump cuts. Smooth transitions naturally draw a connecting line between the start and end point. In this example, a player understands that selecting an icon in command mode results in direct player control in action mode. Next, notice the developers again use a camera transition to direct a player where to go, effectively showing the player what to do next. This is the same technique that I just discussed. Ultimately, the player is the camera. Now, the player may not consciously realize this, but the developer definitely does. By moving the camera around, the developers are explaining to the player important information. Things like where to go, what the player is in control over, and how two very different game modes are related to each other. The specific lesson to be learned here, instead of writing a tutorial, see if you can express the same information by just moving the camera around. And finally, the player gets to control their first character. Isn't it glorious? Only to be interrupted with another tutorial. It was fun for a few seconds of gameplay. Yes, designing a tutorial is hard. They're slow and boring and decidedly not fun. For someone who has played a lot of games before or are otherwise familiar with common user input schemes, they might not even be useful. But for most players, this tutorial section is critical. Most games that are fun are also complicated, so it makes sense to have a in-depth tutorial teaching the complicated system to a new player. Learning how to make a good tutorial is critical for learning how to make a good game, so please bear with me. I promise this next point is the last of the tutorial analysis. After the player shoots the enemy for the first time, another tutorial box comes up about ending actions. A unit with no AP and no actions is unable to act further. That's more or less the current situation. Providing a tutorial that describes what is currently going on is good design. Then, the tutorial goes on and explains how to end the current action. The developers don't give you a reason why you may want to end an action early, they just let the player know that they can. But as soon as the tutorial text ends, the player will understand why they may want to do that. The enemy has free reign to fire at Welkin. The player will realize that it is strictly a bad idea to stay standing here. The only thing that the player can do to get out of the situation is to end their action early. This is a subtle point. All the tutorials so far have been merely suggestions for a player. Saving is a good idea, but not required. You can end an action early this way, but it's up to you. The developers are simply explaining the game rules and maybe providing a little friendly advice, but there are no hard quests or requirements the player has to accomplish in order to progress. Personally, I like this style of tutorial, simply explaining the game rules as they become relevant and let the player figure out what to do. This style of teaching reinforces to a player that they alone have to make the decisions and primes them for tactical and strategic thinking later in the game. To simplify my point, this tutorial reflects the rest of the game. It will give you advice and it will give you choices, but you are the one calling the shots, and sometimes the choices this game gives you are really challenging. But this is the first operation, so the choice of should I end my turn early is a pretty easy one. Hopefully, another easy choice for you, the viewer, is whether or not you wish to subscribe. If you wish to improve your game design skills or just want to understand the games you play in a deeper level, I hope you would consider it. The rest of this operation is nondescript. There are even more tutorials explaining the mechanics of headshots and taking cover behind sandbags. The only other relevant item that I want to point out today is the level architecture. Notice, the player starts off in a relatively small linear roadway. I've talked extensively about what I call hallway architecture and why it's a good choice for a tutorial level back in the first episode of the Halo series. But to summarize, clear lines and narrow paths allow a player to focus on learning how to move the camera and characters. The simple architecture eliminates complexities and forces a player to progress in a predictable way, which allows for effective tutorials to be set up. Like a choke point, but for learning. Ultimately, the player will complete the operation and the combat report clipboard appears, telling the player how it went. It also shows how much experience and DCT we've earned, the two currencies of the game. Now, most of this clipboard is blank right now. There were no enemy tanks or enemy leaders in this level, but again, this acts as foreshadowing and makes the player look forward to the days when they can take on an enemy destroyer tank. Before I end, a word about these currencies. Typically, I play through each level a few times in the process of making these videos. I will keep track of how much currency I earn each time and only spend the currency that I've earned from the first playthrough of each level. This way, I will approximate the challenge curve the developers intended a typical player to stick to. Eventually, I'll run into a wall and I will have to spend more of this currency, but I will let you know when that happens. In the next episode, the beloved hometown of Brule gets attacked for real. I'll see you there.